When my husband passed, I thought grief would be the hardest part, but little did I know, the real trial would begin with the $41 million secret he left behind, and I never told my children. Thank heavens I didn't, because one of them showed up with a lawyer the very next week. Now, before I begin, let me pause for just a moment. My name is Ruth Ann Carter, though most people just call me Ruth. I'm an old woman now, sitting in the same home where I raised my children, surrounded by photographs of happier days. But time has a way of changing everything, doesn't it? If you're watching this, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Are you sitting in your living room, maybe with a cup of tea? Or perhaps watching quietly in bed, the way I sometimes do when I can't sleep? Leave me a little note in the comments. It warms my heart to know where stories like mine are being heard. Now then, let's begin. I married my husband Daniel when I was just 22. He was a quiet man, reserved to outsiders, but full of kindness with those he trusted. Daniel believed in the value of hard work, humility, and in never flaunting what you had. We built a life that was comfortable, though to the outside world it may have looked modest. A 2-story home with creaking floorboards, a vegetable garden out back, and a family station wagon that saw far too many school trips and road journeys to count. But behind that simple life, Daniel was careful. He worked as an investor, nothing flashy, nothing you'd read about in the papers. He wasn't the type to gamble on wild business ventures or chase after greed. Instead, he believed in patience. Over the decades, slowly but surely, his investments grew. And what started as a small nest egg blossomed into something extraordinary: $41 million. Now, you must understand, our children never knew. To them, we were ordinary parents who sometimes had to say no when they wanted new shoes or when they begged for the latest toys. Daniel and I agreed early on. We would not raise spoiled children. He used to say, "Money doesn't change who you are, it just reveals it." At the time, I thought it was just one of his old sayings. Later, I realized how painfully true it was. We had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, each of them so different in character. My eldest, Richard, was ambitious from the start. He wanted to climb ladders, make his mark, and be somebody important. My middle child, Caroline, had a softer heart, always looking after her younger brother when he was small, and later, after me when I felt unwell. And then there was Jonathan, the youngest, bright but distant. He often felt like the world owed him something, though I prayed time would smooth out those sharp edges. For years, life went on. Holidays, birthdays, graduations, those family milestones we mothers hold so dear. And though Daniel's fortune grew silently in the background, we never changed the way we lived. We didn't move into a mansion. We didn't buy yachts or diamond necklaces. To the neighbors, we were simply the Carters, reliable, steady, unremarkable. Then came the day I dread even now to recall, the day I lost Daniel. It was a quiet morning, the kind that lulls you into believing everything is just as it should be. He'd been ill for some time, though he never liked to admit it. Sitting beside his bed, I held his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep, and in those final moments, his voice, though weak, was steady. "Ruth," he said, "promise me you'll keep it quiet. The money. It mustn't tear them apart. Not yet. Wait until the time is right." My heart broke as I nodded. How could I think of money when the man I had loved for 50 years was slipping away from me? Yet his eyes, even then, were clear with purpose. He was right. I knew it then, as I know it now. After his funeral, the house was full of flowers, neighbors dropping by with casseroles, and my children hovering around with their well-meaning but awkward attempts at comfort. Grief makes people strange. Some draw closer, clinging to one another. Others retreat into themselves, unwilling to face the weight of loss. And some look beyond the sorrow and wonder what is left behind. It was only a week later that Richard, my ambitious eldest, arrived at my door. But he was not alone. At his side stood a man in a sharp suit carrying a briefcase. My heart sank before a word was even spoken. "Mother," Richard began, his tone already rehearsed, "we need to talk about Father's estate." And in that moment, as I watched the lawyer open his briefcase and shuffle through documents, I thanked God that I had kept my silence, because if they had known about the $41 million, well, that was the moment I realized just how right Daniel had been. When I think back on those years before Daniel's passing, what strikes me most is how ordinary everything appeared. To the outside world, we were no different from the neighbors next door. We waved when people walked by, hung laundry on the line, and trimmed the hedges ourselves. Our home was the sort where the kettle always seemed to whistle just as someone came in through the back door, and the scent of fresh bread often lingered in the kitchen. We were not poor, not by any means, but we lived with the dignity of simplicity. Daniel was deliberate about it. He insisted that our children know the value of work and responsibility. He often reminded me that if children are given too much too soon, they begin to see love measured in money rather than in time, sacrifice, and care. "I want them to build lives with their own hands, Ruth," he would say as we sat on the porch in the evenings, "not lives cushioned by mine." And so, while he quietly built his investments, we lived as if our income was modest. The children wore hand-me-downs more often than not. Christmas mornings were joyful but not extravagant. When Richard wanted a bicycle, Daniel told him he'd have to mow lawns around the neighborhood until he could pay for half of it himself. Richard grumbled, but he did it. Caroline, sweet girl, often saved bits of her allowance to surprise me with flowers, and Jonathan, well, he was always the dreamer. He had lofty ideas, but not much patience for the small steps it took to reach them. Looking back, I see how different they were even as children. Richard, the eldest, had ambition written all over him. He wanted to be in charge, to be recognized, to stand taller than the rest. When he played board games, he played to win. No mercy, no hesitation. Caroline was his opposite in many ways, content to lose if it meant someone else could smile. She would be the first to share her candy, the first to comfort a neighbor's crying child. And Jonathan was complicated. He had charm, yes, and intelligence too, but he also had a streak of entitlement. If something didn't go his way, he would sulk, muttering about how unfair life was. At the time, I thought it was just the way of children. After all, don't all siblings carry their little quirks and rivalries? But in hindsight, I see it was the very fabric of who they were becoming. Daniel saw it too, though he rarely said much. He had a quiet way of observing, his eyes lingering just long enough to tell me he was making mental notes. Sometimes, after the children went to bed, he would sigh and murmur, "Money will test them one day, Ruth. It will show what's inside." I used to brush off those comments. After all, wasn't love enough to bind a family together? We sat around the dinner table every evening, passing bowls of potatoes and roasted chicken, listening to each child recount their day. We went to church on Sundays. We took summer trips in the old car, and we decorated the house with pumpkins in the fall. Love was there, woven into every moment. Surely that was stronger than any temptation wealth could bring. But Daniel knew better. He had seen men destroyed by greed during his years in business. He had watched partners turn on each other, brothers stop speaking for life, and families torn apart when fortunes were revealed. "It doesn't make a man greedy," he told me once. "It only uncovers the greed that was already there." I will never forget one particular evening. It must have been a decade before he passed. We were sitting in the living room, Daniel reading his newspaper while I sewed a button onto Jonathan's shirt. Richard had just come home from college for the holidays, full of big talk about success and status. He teased Caroline for wanting to study nursing, calling it a thankless job. Jonathan, who was about 16 at the time, chimed in with a careless remark about how one day he would never have to work because things always come easy to him. I remember the way Daniel lowered his paper and fixed his gaze on our boys. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Work is never beneath you," he said, and entitlement will take everything from you if you let it." They rolled their eyes as young people do, but I saw the truth settle in his expression. He wasn't just speaking to them, he was warning them. That night, when the children had gone upstairs, Daniel leaned close to me and whispered, "If something happens to me before they're ready, promise me you'll hold it close. Don't give them the key until you know their hearts can bear it." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, but as I look back now, I realize that was the moment he placed the weight of our future into my hands. And so, while life continued in its ordinary rhythm, school plays, scraped knees, weddings, and grandchildren, the great secret rested quietly beneath it all. The fortune Daniel had built, carefully hidden from sight, waiting like a test none of us could yet imagine. The day I lost Daniel is etched into my memory with a sharpness that time has never dulled. Grief has a strange way of stretching a single moment into eternity, as though every detail insists on being remembered. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and feel the heavy stillness of that morning. Daniel had been unwell for several months. Though he carried his illness with the same quiet dignity, he carried everything else in life. He never once complained, never asked, "Why me?" He continued to read his papers, tend to the garden when his strength allowed, and sit beside me at the kitchen table as though nothing had changed. But I could see it. The way his hands trembled, the paleness of his skin, the heaviness in his step. I knew the end was approaching, though my heart refused to admit it. That morning, I was by his bedside, the curtains drawn back just enough to let the sunlight spill across the room. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets I kept in the drawers. Daniel's breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest more precious than gold. I held his hand in both of mine, as though my grip could somehow anchor him to this world. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I leaned closer, desperate not to miss a single word. "You must promise me something." "Anything, Daniel," I said, though my throat was thick with tears. "The money, you must keep it quiet. Not yet, not with them. They're not ready. It will tear them apart." I wanted to protest, to tell him that our children would never betray one another, but the look in his eyes silenced me. They were steady, resolute, filled with the wisdom of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He knew them better than I did in that moment, knew the flaws and the dangers that wealth could awaken. So I nodded. "I promise." His hand squeezed mine faintly, then relaxed, and with a final breath, he was gone. The days that followed blurred into a haze of arrangements, phone calls, and visitors. The house filled with the scent of lilies, the kind people bring to funerals. Neighbors arrived with casseroles and pies, speaking in hushed voices as though volume itself could disturb the fragile silence. My children moved through it all like shadows, each coping in their own way. Richard, ever the ambitious one, was restless. He busied himself with tasks, taking charge of funeral arrangements, handling calls, speaking as though efficiency could disguise the grief beneath his surface. Caroline, my gentle girl, hovered close to me, making sure I ate, making sure I rested. She cried openly, and her tears felt like a mirror to my own. Jonathan, though, he was different. He withdrew, spending long hours alone, his face a mask of unreadable thoughts. The funeral itself was dignified, as Daniel would have wanted. Friends from his business days came to pay their respects, each offering words about his integrity and his wisdom. Our church pews were filled with neighbors who remembered his kindness, and I, seated in the front row with my children beside me, felt as though the world had tilted off its axis. My anchor was gone. Afterward, when the guests had left and the house fell quiet again, I sat alone in Daniel's chair. The promise echoed in my mind, heavy and unshakable. $41 million. It seemed almost unreal, a number so large it hardly fit into the contours of my ordinary life. but it was real. Tucked away in accounts and investments only I now held the keys to. And it was mine to protect. Not for myself, but for the man I had loved and the legacy he had left. That first week was the hardest. Grief came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crushing. I would find myself reaching across the bed in the night, only to be met by the cold emptiness of his absence. The kettle would whistle in the kitchen, and I would turn instinctively to call him before remembering he was no longer there to come. Yet even in the depths of sorrow, I held on to his final words. I had promised him, and I intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. But promises are not without trials. Barely 7 days had passed when the first test arrived at my doorstep. Richard came to see me, dressed sharply despite the somber week. At his side was a man I had never met before, carrying a briefcase. My stomach twisted the moment I saw them. "Mother," Richard began, his tone clipped and formal, "we need to discuss Father's estate. There are matters that must be settled." The lawyer set his briefcase on the table, flipping it open with practiced precision. Papers shuffled, contracts appeared, pens were readied, and all the while I sat in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought of Daniel. I thought of his warning, and in that moment, as Richard's eyes glinted with something sharper than grief, I thanked God I had kept the secret. Because if they knew, if any of them knew, about the $41 million, then the cracks in our family would widen into unbridgeable chasms. The storm had begun. When Richard walked in with that lawyer at his side, the air in my home changed. It no longer felt like the house where Daniel and I had raised our children, where birthdays and Christmas mornings had filled the rooms with laughter. Instead, it felt like a cold boardroom, and I was suddenly a defendant in a case I hadn't known existed. The lawyer introduced himself briskly, with that clipped politeness that only deepened my unease. His voice was smooth, his manner practiced, as though he had delivered the same speech 100 times before. He opened his briefcase, spread the documents across my dining table, and began explaining the legal process of settling an estate. Richard sat beside him, shoulders squared, jaw tight, his eyes darting between me and the pages as though waiting for me to sign away something. It wasn't grief I saw in him then, it was hunger. "Mother," Richard began, speaking as if he were the head of the family now, "we need to move forward quickly. It's best to get everything sorted before complications arise. Father's will must be processed and assets declared." Complications, assets declared, words that carried sharp edges. I looked at him, this boy I had once rocked to sleep in the middle of the night, this man who now sat across from me like a stranger. My heart ached, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "Richard," I said softly, "your father's affairs are in order. There's no rush. These things take time." The lawyer interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Carter, it would be beneficial for everyone involved to disclose the full scope of Mr. Carter's estate. Transparency now will prevent disputes later." His pen tapped against the paper, a quiet rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Inside, panic churned. My promise to Daniel echoed louder than the lawyer's words. The money must stay hidden. Not yet. Not with them. They weren't ready, and already Richard's impatience was proof enough of that. "I understand," I said carefully, folding my hands in my lap. "But there is nothing unusual to disclose. The house, the car, some savings. Your father lived simply, as you know." Richard's eyes narrowed. For a moment, silence stretched between us. Then he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said, though his tone carried doubt. The lawyer gathered the papers, offering me a tight smile. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Carter." When they left, I sank into Daniel's chair, trembling. My home felt violated, as though the walls themselves had overheard a secret I could no longer keep. That night, I sat awake long after the house was quiet, staring at the old family photographs on the mantel. There was Richard, age 10, holding up the bicycle he had worked so hard to buy. There was Caroline, smiling shyly in her school uniform. There was Jonathan, grinning mischievously, his hair sticking up in every direction. My children, my babies. How had it come to this? I remembered Daniel's words again. Money doesn't change who you are. It reveals it. And now I saw the truth beginning to emerge. Richard wasn't mourning his father. He was calculating what he could gain. The following days brought no peace. Richard began calling more often, his tone clipped and businesslike, pressing me about papers and records. Caroline came too, but her visits were different. She sat with me, brought me tea, helped fold laundry. She never asked about the will. She only asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough. My heart clung to her gentleness, the lifeline I needed. Jonathan, however, became more distant. He didn't visit as much, but when he did, his questions were pointed. "So, Mom," he asked one evening, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved into his pockets, "what did Dad leave behind? Anything worth talking about?" His casual tone was a thin veil. Beneath it, I heard the same hunger I had seen in Richard's eyes. I smiled faintly, shook my head. "Not much, Jonathan, just the house, a little savings." He smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Right, just checking." As he left, I felt a chill sweep through me. My sons were circling, sniffing around for answers, and I, armed only with my promise to Daniel, was left to fend them off. One evening, when the house was quiet, I took out the old wooden box where Daniel kept important letters. Inside was a note he had written to me years before, long before illness had touched him. His handwriting was strong, the ink slightly faded. "Ruth, if you're reading this, it means you carry the burden now. Remember, wealth is only a tool. It can build or it can destroy. Do not hand it over to those unready, for it will consume them. Guard it until you see wisdom in their hearts." I traced the letters with trembling fingers, tears blurring my vision. The task was heavier than I had ever imagined. But in that moment, I resolved something within myself. I would not break. I would not hand over Daniel's legacy to greed and entitlement. My children might demand answers. They might bring lawyers. They might even turn against me. But I would keep the promise. Still, as I extinguished the lamp and the house sank into darkness, one question haunted me. If Richard had already brought a lawyer within a week, what else might they do once suspicion grew? The storm clouds were gathering, and I was standing alone at the center. The house grew quiet again after Richard's visit, but it was not the comforting kind of quiet Daniel and I used to share in the evenings. This was a hollow silence, heavy with suspicion. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me that the walls now carried secrets. Secrets I alone was trusted to guard. I often found myself drifting into memories of Daniel, as though replaying his voice could guide me through the storm that had begun. He had always been a man of strong convictions, shaped not by wealth, but by hardship. Daniel had grown up in a modest home, the son of a mechanic and a school teacher. His parents instilled in him the belief that money was never an end, only a means. He used to tell me that when you strip away all the glitter of wealth, you see who people truly are. One evening, long ago when the children were still young, I remember Daniel sitting at the head of the dinner table, his expression unusually serious. The children had been bickering over something small, perhaps dessert portions or who had the bigger share. Daniel set down his fork, folded his hands, and said in that steady voice of his, "Listen to me, all of you. Money and possessions will never fix unhappiness. If you measure love in things, you will spend your life empty. True wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you give." The children had quieted then, though I doubt they understood. I did. I always understood. And I tried in my own way to weave those words into the fabric of our lives. But now, watching Richard's ambition sharpen and Jonathan's curiosity take on a dangerous edge, I wondered if those lessons had been lost along the way. It pained me because I remembered how fiercely Daniel believed in testing character. He used to say that adversity shows a person's strength, but money shows their soul. I see now that he was right. In the week after his passing, adversity had brought Caroline closer to me, her compassion shining brighter than ever. But even the faintest whiff of wealth had stirred greed in the others like embers catching flame. There were moments I considered telling them the truth. After all, what mother wants to lie to her children? I would sit in Daniel's chair at night, staring into the shadows, asking myself if I was being cruel by keeping them in the dark. They were grieving too, each in their way. Would it not comfort them to know that their father had left behind security that they would never want for money again? But then I would hear Daniel's voice in my memory. Not yet, not until they are ready. And the conviction in his tone silenced my doubts, because readiness was not about age or status, it was about heart. And I could see plain as day that my sons' hearts were not ready. The moral weight pressed heavily on me. I was not only their mother now, I was the guardian of their father's legacy. If I handed it over too soon, I would not only betray Daniel's trust, but also doom my children to be consumed by greed. I imagined them fighting bitterly, dragging one another into courtrooms, breaking bonds that could never be repaired. And all for what? For money that should have been a blessing, but would surely turn into poison in the wrong hands. I remembered a story Daniel once told me about a colleague of his who had inherited a fortune from an uncle. Within 2 years, the man was bankrupt, cheated by supposed friends, abandoned by his siblings, divorced and alone. It wasn't the money that ruined him, Daniel said quietly. It was the way it revealed the worst in those around him, and he wasn't strong enough to stand against it. Those words haunted me now. My sons were circling, hungry for answers, while Caroline's gentle nature made her vulnerable to being trampled in the crossfire. If the truth came out too soon, the fortune would not bless them. It would destroy them. So I told myself, again and again, that silence was not cruelty. Silence was protection. My secret was not a betrayal. It was an act of love. Yet love is a complicated thing, isn't it? It asks us to endure guilt, to shoulder burdens we'd rather put down, to stand firm when our hearts long to give in. Every time I looked at Richard's determined face or heard Jonathan's casual questions, my resolve hardened. I would not let their greed dishonor Daniel's name. But I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Greed is a seed. Once planted, it does not simply vanish. It grows, creeping quietly into thoughts, into actions, until one day it bursts into full bloom. My sons had already tasted suspicion. What would they do when suspicion turned into certainty? As I sat alone one evening, the clock ticking steadily on the mantel, I whispered into the empty room, "Daniel, I hope I'm strong enough." Because I could feel it already, the storm gathering, and I knew sooner or later it would break wide open. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. Suspicion is like smoke once it slips into the cracks. It seeps everywhere no matter how tightly you shut the doors. The first sign came one Sunday afternoon. Caroline had come over with her usual sweetness, bringing me a basket of muffins and fussing over whether I was eating properly. Richard arrived shortly after, his face set with the kind of seriousness that meant business, not comfort. Jonathan was the last to come, strolling in late with a casual shrug, though his eyes darted around the house as if searching for something. We gathered around the dinner table, just as we had countless times before. I had roasted a chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, a simple meal, the kind Daniel used to love. But instead of laughter or stories of the week, silence settled over us like an unwelcome guest. Richard was the first to break it. He set down his fork with a sharp clink against the plate. "Mother," he said, his tone too formal for a family dinner, "I think we should be honest with one another. Father wasn't as simple as he pretended to be. He had investments, didn't he? Accounts we don't know about?" Caroline's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes flicked to mine, wide with surprise. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly as though amused by Richard's bluntness. "Richard," I said carefully, "your father believed in living modestly. We have the house, a bit of savings. There isn't much more." Richard's jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe that? A man who spent his life working in finance has nothing to show for it?" Jonathan chuckled under his breath. "He's right, Mom. Dad wasn't some fool with a piggy bank. He had something, probably tucked away, waiting. The question is where?" Caroline set her fork down softly. "Why does it matter?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "He's gone. We should be grieving, not squabbling over money." Her words should have softened the room, but instead they seemed to ignite it. Richard leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Don't be naive, Caroline. If there's something left behind, it's our right to know. We're his children." "And what about Mother?" Caroline shot back, surprising me with her sudden fire. "Doesn't she have the right to peace? To not be hounded like this?" The tension crackled. Jonathan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Let's not pretend here. If there's money, we all know it changes everything. Why waste time pretending otherwise?" I forced a calm smile, though inside my heart was racing. "Children," I said, "your father gave you the greatest inheritance already, his values. He wanted you to work hard to build lives of your own. That's more valuable than money." Richard scoffed and Jonathan rolled his eyes. Caroline looked down at her plate, tears threatening. That night, after they had gone, I sat alone in the quiet dining room, staring at the half-eaten food left behind. The voices of my children still echoed in the walls, sharp with accusation, heavy with doubt. It struck me then how quickly suspicion had turned our family gathering into a battlefield. Over the following weeks, the questions didn't stop. Richard began dropping by unannounced, always with some pretense of checking on me, but inevitably steering the conversation back to Father's hidden accounts. Jonathan called less frequently, but when he did, his tone was laced with curiosity, probing gently as though he believed he could charm the truth out of me. Caroline continued to visit, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She tried to protect me, tried to steer conversations away from inheritance, but even she couldn't ignore the growing tension between her brothers. The worst was the gossip that began to creep in from outside. A neighbor, well-meaning but meddlesome, stopped me on my walk one morning. "I heard Daniel was quite successful with investments," she said with a knowing smile. "Must be comforting to know you're well provided for." I forced a polite laugh, my stomach tightening. Who had she heard that from? Was it Richard, Jonathan? Or perhaps the lawyer spreading quiet rumors after his visit? It became clear to me that the secret was no longer mine alone to guard. Others were circling, sniffing for truth, and the more my children doubted, the closer they came to tearing one another apart. One evening, as I was putting away dishes, Caroline lingered behind. She placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Mother," she whispered, "promise me you won't let them bully you. Whatever Father left or didn't leave, it's yours first. Please don't let them push you into anything." Her eyes shone with sincerity, and for a moment the burden felt lighter, but it was only for a moment, because I knew that suspicion, once planted, does not fade. It festers, it grows. And my sons, my flesh and blood, were already letting it take root in their hearts. The strain of my children's questions began to press on me like a tightening noose. Each visit, each phone call, each sideways glance chipped away at the fragile peace in my home. I realized that if I didn't take steps to secure what Daniel had left behind, the secret might slip through my fingers before I was ready. And so, one chilly morning, I dressed in my best coat, slipped Daniel's old leather folder under my arm, and took the bus into town. The folder held the documents, the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Bank statements, investment papers, and the instructions Daniel had left me. I felt the weight of it against my side as though I were carrying a treasure chest in plain sight. When I arrived at the bank, the tall glass doors reflected my pale face back at me. For a moment, I hesitated. I thought of Daniel's voice, his warning, his trust in me. My heart pounded. But then I straightened my shoulders and walked inside. The bank smelled of polished wood and cold air. Men in suits moved briskly through the lobby, and the click of typewriters and printers hummed behind the counters. A young clerk looked up at me with professional courtesy. "Good morning, ma'am. How can we help you today?" I gave my name softly, explaining that I needed to access my late husband's accounts. The clerk's expression changed immediately, a flicker of recognition, followed by deference. He excused himself and returned moments later with a manager. The manager, a gray-haired gentleman with kind but calculating eyes, guided me into a private office. He spoke in hushed tones, offering condolences, then carefully opened Daniel's file on his desk. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "your husband was an exceptionally prudent man. His accounts are secure, but I must tell you inquiries have already been made." My breath caught. "Inquiries?" "Yes," the manager nodded gravely. "A lawyer contacted us, asking for information regarding Mr. Carter's estate. Naturally, we disclose nothing without proper documentation, but it suggests others may soon attempt to press the matter." I sat frozen, my hands clutching the leather folder in my lap. Already Richard's ambition was reaching into places I had prayed it wouldn't. The manager continued, "You are the sole holder of these accounts now. No one else can access them without your authorization. But I must advise you keep the records secure. The sums involved are considerable." He slid a sheet of paper across the desk, listing the totals. I had seen the numbers before in Daniel's notes, but seeing them typed neatly on official letterhead made my head spin. $41 million, written plainly as though it were nothing more than ink and paper. I stared at the figure until it blurred before my eyes. My throat tightened. It wasn't just money. It was Daniel's lifetime of discipline, his trust in me, and his legacy. And it was also a loaded gun, aimed directly at the fragile bonds of my family. With trembling hands, I signed the necessary documents, reaffirming my sole authority over the accounts. The pen scratched against the paper, sealing my role as guardian of the fortune. I could feel the gravity of it pressing down on me with each stroke. When the manager escorted me to the vault to review Daniel's safety deposit box, I nearly faltered. The steel door loomed ahead, massive and foreboding. Inside, the small box contained bonds, deeds, and a handwritten letter Daniel had left for me, one I hadn't seen before. My fingers shook as I unfolded it. "Ruth, if you are here, it means the time has come. Be brave. Remember, the money is not the legacy. You are. Protect it as long as you must. Trust your judgment and trust yourself." Tears spilled down my cheeks. His words were both a comfort and a burden. I pressed the letter to my chest before carefully placing it back inside. When I left the bank that afternoon, the sky had turned gray, and the chill in the air felt sharper. The city around me bustled as though nothing had changed, but inside me everything had. I was no longer simply a grieving widow. I was a keeper of secrets, standing guard over a fortune that could destroy my family if revealed too soon. On the ride home, I caught my reflection in the bus window. I looked tired, older than my years, but there was also something else, a spark of determination. Daniel had trusted me with this task because he knew I could bear it, and I would. But as the bus rumbled down familiar streets, a gnawing fear took hold. Richard was already sniffing at the trail. Jonathan's curiosity was sharpening. Caroline was kind, but kindness alone could not shield her from the storm brewing between her brothers. The question that haunted me was not if they would come for the truth. It was when. And after what I'd seen at the bank, the inquiries, the hunger already stirring in the air, I knew that day was fast approaching. In the weeks after my visit to the bank, the tension in the family only seemed to grow sharper. Richard's calls became more frequent, and though his tone was always polite, it carried the clipped precision of a man conducting business, not speaking with his mother. Jonathan appeared at odd hours, sometimes under the guise of checking in, other times with veiled questions that left me uneasy. But Caroline, sweet Caroline, was different. One late afternoon, she came by with a pot of stew, insisting I shouldn't cook for myself every night. The house smelled of thyme and garlic as we set the pot on the stove, and for the first time in days I felt the warmth of comfort instead of suspicion. She didn't pepper me with questions, didn't eye the corners of the house as though secrets might be hidden there. She simply fussed over me, adjusting the blanket on my chair, tidying the living room, humming softly as she worked. When we finally sat down together, I saw the weariness in her eyes. It wasn't just grief she carried. It was the strain of trying to hold our family together. "Mother," she began softly, "I don't know what Richard and Jonathan are chasing, but I need you to know something. I don't care if there's nothing left at all. I don't care if Father left a fortune or not a penny. I just want you safe. That's all that matters to me." Her words washed over me like balm. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I reached across the table, took her hand in mine, and simply squeezed. "Caroline," I whispered, "your father always said you had the truest heart. And he was right." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Then promise me you won't let them bully you. Promise me you won't let them take your peace." I nodded, though inside I thought, if only you knew how much there is to take. That night, as Caroline dozed on the sofa while we watched an old film, I found myself studying her face. She looked so much like Daniel when she smiled, gentle, steady, kind. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. Perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps the storm that threatened to tear us apart might still leave one unbroken bond. But even as I took comfort in her loyalty, I knew what her support meant. The battle lines were being drawn. If Caroline stood beside me, she would inevitably find herself standing against her brothers. The thought pained me deeply. I wanted my children united, not divided, and yet their actions left me no choice. The following Sunday, Richard came again, this time without the lawyer. He spoke directly, his eyes sharp. "Mother, I've been reviewing Father's career. I know he handled investments. Don't tell me he left nothing. It doesn't add up." Caroline, who had arrived just before him, bristled. "Richard, stop. Can't you see what you're doing? You're treating her like a suspect, not our mother." Richard turned to her, his expression hard. "Don't be childish, Caroline. This isn't about feelings. It's about facts. We have a right to know." I held up my hand, silencing them both. "Enough. This is my home, and I will not have arguments here. Your father left what he chose to leave. That is all you need to know." Richard's eyes flashed with frustration, but Caroline stood firm beside me, her hand slipping into mine beneath the table. For the first time, I felt the strength of not standing entirely alone. After Richard stormed out, Caroline stayed behind, her face pale but resolute. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "Jonathan either. They're circling like wolves. But I'll stand with you, Mother, no matter what." Her loyalty gave me courage. Later that night, when I sat alone in the darkened living room, I thought of Daniel's words again. "Wait until they are ready." Perhaps he had known all along that only one of our children would truly understand. Perhaps the legacy wasn't meant for all of them. Still, the comfort of Caroline's support was tempered by fear. If she saw the truth of her brother's greed, then surely they saw her loyalty as well. And greed, once challenged, becomes more dangerous. For now, though, I clung to her words. "I just want you safe." They reminded me that amidst betrayal and suspicion, there was still love. And that love, fragile as it was, might be the only thing that could keep me standing when the storm finally broke. For a time I allowed myself to believe that Caroline's loyalty might steady the waters, that her kindness could soothe the rough edges of her brother's ambition. But hope, I've learned, is a fragile thing. It flickers like a candle, one gust of wind, and it is gone. The gust came not long after our last family dinner, when a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, the handwriting unfamiliar, the weight of it unnerving. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a formal notice from the county court. My son, my own Richard, had filed a petition demanding disclosure of Daniel's estate. The words swam before my eyes. Petition, probate, full accounting of assets, court order. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands grew cold. The paper slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. I sat there in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the letter that turned my grief into a battlefield. It wasn't enough for Richard to badger me with questions or to bring a lawyer into my home. Now he had dragged our private sorrow into the harsh light of the courts. When Caroline came by later that afternoon, she found me still seated at the table, the papers spread out before me. Her eyes widened as she read them, and then filled with tears. "Oh, Mother," she whispered, kneeling beside me, "how could he do this to you?" Her voice cracked with both anger and sadness, but I could not answer. I simply shook my head, too weary to find words. The days that followed were a blur of consultations and paperwork. I had to sit across from attorneys, men in suits who spoke in clipped tones about disclosure and probate proceedings, as if my life were nothing more than a set of files to be examined. Each word felt like another stone pressing down on my chest. At night, sleep eluded me. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing Daniel's voice in my memory. "Wait until they are ready," I whispered back into the darkness. "They're not ready, Daniel. Not at all." Jonathan, for his part, was no better. Though he hadn't filed anything, he began circling more openly, phoning me late in the evenings, his voice deceptively light. "Mother," he said once, "maybe it would be easier if you just told us everything now. Think about it, no more lawyers, no more secrets. We could settle it quietly, as a family." The word quietly lingered in the air like a threat. I knew better than to trust his tone. Jonathan didn't want peace. He wanted leverage. But Caroline stood beside me, as steady as ever. She accompanied me to meetings, sat with me while lawyers droned on and whispered reassurances when I faltered. "We'll get through this, Mother. Don't let them scare you." Her strength kept me upright, but still, I could not ignore the reality. Richard had forced my hand. I would have to go to court, sit beneath the gaze of a judge, and defend myself against my own child. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in Daniel's chair, clutching the letter he had left in the bank vault. His handwriting steadied me. "Be brave. Trust yourself." I tried to summon bravery, but all I felt was exhaustion. Grief had not yet loosened its hold on me, and now betrayal tightened it further. I thought of the years I had spent raising Richard, of the scraped knees I had bandaged, the lunches I had packed, the nights I had stayed awake waiting for him to come home safe. How quickly all of that was forgotten, replaced by legal papers and cold demands. When morning came, I dressed carefully, choosing the navy dress Daniel had always admired. I pinned my hair, clasped a string of pearls around my neck, and forced my trembling hands to still. If I was to face my son in court, I would do so with dignity. As Caroline drove me to the courthouse, the city streets blurred past in a haze of nerves and sorrow. She reached over, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "We'll get through this, together." But deep inside, I knew the truth. Together or not, the storm had broken, and there was no going back. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, a place where lives were measured in filings and judgments. As Caroline and I walked down the long corridor, my heels echoing against the marble floor, my heart thudded painfully in my chest. I never imagined I would find myself here, not as a witness to some stranger's dispute, but as the target of my own child's petition. We entered the courtroom, its high ceilings and solemn benches casting an air of severity. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, presided from her elevated seat. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered to their clients, and glanced over at me as though I were an exhibit on display. And then I saw him. Richard, my son. He was seated at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his jaw set with determination. The lawyer he had brought to my home now sat beside him, flipping through files with a confident smirk. For a moment, Richard's eyes met mine. There was no warmth there. No trace of the boy who once held my hand as we crossed the street, who used to beg for one more bedtime story. Instead, I saw calculation, ambition, hunger. I lowered myself into the chair beside my attorney, Caroline at my side. She reached for my hand beneath the table and gave it a reassuring squeeze. The proceedings began. Richard's lawyer rose, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor," he said, "we are here today to request full disclosure of the estate of the late Daniel Carter. We believe substantial assets have not been declared, and we seek transparency in accordance with probate law." His words sliced through the room, each syllable a blade aimed squarely at me. My attorney rose in response, calm but firm. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carter has complied fully with all legal requirements. There is no evidence of undisclosed assets. These accusations are speculative at best." The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any proof, Mr. Hollister?" she asked Richard's lawyer. The man spread his hands with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, while we do not yet have concrete proof, we believe further investigation is warranted. Mr. Carter's career in finance suggests that more exists than has been presented. Speculation, assumptions, hints and shadows dressed up as evidence." Then it was my turn. My attorney guided me to the witness stand. My knees trembled as I stood, but I forced myself to keep my back straight. I raised my hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat beneath the gaze of the court. "Mrs. Carter," the lawyer began, his tone polite but probing, "your husband worked for many years in investments, did he not?" "Yes," I answered, my voice steady. "And yet you would have this court believe that after a lifetime of financial work, he left behind only a modest home and small savings?" I met his gaze. My husband believed in living simply. Whatever he earned, he managed quietly. He did not flaunt wealth, and he did not share every detail with others. What he chose to leave behind was his decision. The lawyer arched an eyebrow, sensing an opening. "So you admit, then, that there may have been more?" My heart pounded, but I remembered Daniel's words. "Be brave, trust yourself." I folded my hands in my lap and said firmly, "I admit nothing beyond what has already been disclosed. My husband's affairs were his own, and I have followed every law required of me." The lawyer pressed on, circling like a predator. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that your son Richard has reason to believe—" The judge cut him off sharply. "Belief is not evidence, Mr. Hollister. Do you have documentation?" He faltered, shuffled papers, and cleared his throat. "Not at this time, Your Honor." The judge's gaze hardened. "Then this court will not entertain speculation. Unless you can provide proof, I see no reason to burden this widow further." Relief surged through me like a tide. For the first time since the summons arrived, I felt the weight lift, if only slightly. Richard's jaw clenched. His lawyer sat down heavily, frustration flashing across his face. Caroline, seated behind me, exhaled a shaky sigh of relief. The judge banged her gavel. "Case dismissed. Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the room like a final bell ringing out not victory, but reprieve. As I rose to leave, I glanced once more at Richard. His face was tight with anger, his eyes cold. He did not speak, did not look at me again as I passed, but I knew what his silence meant. This was not over. Outside, the sun shone brightly, mocking the storm that churned in my chest. Caroline slipped her arm through mine, steadying me as we descended the courthouse steps. "You did it, Mother," she whispered. "It's over." But I shook my head. "No, child, it's only beginning." Because I knew my son. Richard was not one to accept defeat, and if the courts could not uncover Daniel's secret, he would find another way. And the thought chilled me to the bone. After the dismissal, I prayed that Richard would finally relent, that the sting of losing in court might humble him. I prayed he would return to being my son, the boy I raised, the man who once carried his father's watch with pride. But prayers, I soon learned, are not always answered in the ways we hope. The weeks that followed were uneasy. Jonathan grew quiet, less visible, but I knew that silence often hides schemes. Richard, meanwhile, stopped calling altogether. For a while, I allowed myself to believe the storm had passed. Until one evening, as I sat reading by lamplight, there was a knock at the door. A tall man in a dark coat introduced himself as a researcher. His questions were casual at first, but quickly turned invasive inquiries about Daniel's work, our finances, my routines. His manner was too polished, too rehearsed. I sent him away with a polite smile, but dread coiled in my stomach. Later that night, when Caroline visited, I told her what had happened. Her face paled. "Mother," she said, "he's not a researcher. He's an investigator. Richard must have hired him." Her words confirmed what my heart already knew. My son, dissatisfied with the courts, had turned to private means. He was willing to dig into every corner of my life, pry into Daniel's legacy, and strip away the dignity of his own mother, all for the promise of wealth. That night, I lay awake in Daniel's chair, clutching his letter from the vault. The words blurred through my tears. "Guard it until you see wisdom in their hearts." But where was the wisdom? I saw only hunger, suspicion, and betrayal. If I left the fortune vulnerable, it would fall into hands unready to wield it. And if that happened, Daniel's legacy, everything he worked for, everything he sacrificed, would rot into dust. I realized then that I could no longer simply wait. I had to act. The next morning, I returned to the bank. The manager received me with the same deference as before, but this time, my voice carried a resolve I had not known I possessed. "I want to establish a trust," I told him, "not for my children directly, for my grandchildren and for causes my husband believed in." The manager leaned back, studying me carefully. "Mrs. Carter, this will limit your children's access." "I know," I said firmly. "That is the point. If they cannot see past greed now, they are not ready to inherit. The money must be shielded, not dangled before them." Together we drew up the documents. The trust would ensure that Caroline's children, and one day Richard's and Jonathan's as well, would have opportunities for education, security, and stability. A portion would go to charities Daniel had admired, scholarships, hospitals, and community programs. But there would be strict conditions. No immediate access, no lump sums to squander, only measured disbursements for needs that aligned with Daniel's values. The rest would remain locked away, growing quietly, just as Daniel had intended, all his life. As I signed the papers, a calm settled over me. For the first time since his death, I felt not just like a widow carrying a burden, but a guardian fulfilling her duty. The pen scratched across the final page, and with it I secured the legacy Daniel had entrusted me to protect. When I returned home, Caroline was waiting. I told her everything about the trust, the conditions, the future. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not only of sadness. "You did the right thing, Mother," she whispered, embracing me tightly. "Father would be proud." Her words steadied me, but the ache in my heart remained, because I knew what they also meant. Richard and Jonathan would see this as betrayal. To them, I had stolen what they believed was theirs. The bond between us, already fraying, might never mend. That evening, I sat alone and watched the sun sink behind the trees. The house glowed in the fading light, the same home where Daniel and I had raised our family, where laughter had once filled the air. And yet, beneath that glow, I felt the shadows of estrangement closing in. I had kept my promise. I had protected Daniel's legacy, but in doing so, I had also accepted the cost. because sometimes love does not look like giving. Sometimes love looks like shielding, even if it means standing against those you love most. And as the stars appeared in the darkening sky, I whispered into the night, I hope one day they'll understand. Time has a way of softening wounds, though not always in the way we hope. The sharpness of grief dulls, the sting of betrayal fades to an ache, and what remains are lessons carved deep, impossible to forget. Years have passed since that stormy season of my life. The trust remains secure, quietly growing, untouched by greed. Caroline still visits me faithfully, her children filling my home with laughter and noise that reminds me of when mine were small. She never once questioned my decision. Instead, she has become my closest companion, the daughter who not only stood beside me but carried me through the darkest hours. Richard and Jonathan. Well, our relationships never healed the way I once dreamed they might. Richard resented the court's dismissal, and when he realized that the trust had sealed away what he considered his, he stopped coming altogether. Jonathan drifts in and out, sometimes calling, sometimes disappearing for months. His voice carries politeness, but distance too, as though a wall stands between us. I mourn that. More than the money, more than the trials, I mourn the loss of closeness with the children I once held in my arms. A mother never stops loving her children, no matter what storms they bring, but love does not blind me. I see them now for who they are. Daniel's words proved true. Money did not change them. It revealed them. And what it revealed was painful. Yet I take solace in knowing that I did not fail Daniel. I kept his promise. I shielded the fortune until it could serve a greater purpose. The trust has already funded scholarships for children who might never have afforded college. It has supported medical research and community programs that Daniel cared about deeply. And one day, when my grandchildren are old enough, they will inherit not just money, but a legacy bound to values, responsibility, compassion, and humility. Sometimes, when I sit by the window in the evenings, I imagine Daniel beside me. I tell him what has become of the fortune, how it grows quietly, how it is helping in ways he would have admired. I tell him about Caroline's loyalty, about the grandchildren he never met, about the bittersweet distance from Richard and Jonathan. And though I cannot hear his voice, I feel his presence, steady and approving. I think often about the meaning of inheritance. People imagine it is about wealth, possessions, houses, and land. But true inheritance, I've learned, is the wisdom and love we leave behind. Money vanishes, possessions crumble, but the lessons we plant in our children, those remain, if only they choose to receive them. Not all of mine did, but one did, and perhaps that is enough. To those of you listening now, wherever you are, whether you are sitting in a quiet kitchen like mine, or lying awake in the dark with only your thoughts for company, remember this. Wealth is never the measure of a life. It can bless, but it can also corrupt. It can build, but it can also destroy. Guard it carefully, not just with papers and accounts, but with the wisdom of knowing who is ready to bear it. My story may sound like a tale of secrecy and betrayal, but in truth, it is a story of love. Love that protects, even when it hurts. Love that holds fast to promises, even when the cost is high. So I thank you for listening, for sitting with me through this long story of mine. It has not been easy to tell, but perhaps in the telling, I've honored Daniel one more time. And before I say goodbye, let me ask you what I asked at the beginning. Where are you listening from tonight? What part of the world has carried my voice into your home? It comforts me to know that stories like mine reach hearts far and wide. May you take with you this one truth: the truest fortune we leave behind is not in banks or safes, but in the love and lessons we give to those who come after us. Thank you, dear friends, and good night.